welcome, Janet.
Thank
you
you
for being here.
Thank you. Amy gives me so much credit, but I told her this morning, I've told her for the past couple of years, that she is in the right place on the Virginia Tech campus and putting together this Elder Care Symposium. I just help hold up a mirror to let her see what I see. That's the only fair thing that I can say. And it's been a pleasure for over all these years of working with Amy and helping do some of the programming. So she and the staff here at Virginia Tech put this Elder Care Symposium together because they've recognized the need to provide these resources, but provide a forum for caregivers when you're in that caregiving role. So before I start into a really tough subject to talk about, and that's elder abuse or adult abuse, let me tell you who I am. Amy had mentioned that I was a caregiver. Actually, I was a caregiver up until 2 years ago. I was the parent of a disabled young adult, and she made me better than I would have been without her. She had a physical disability, but normal intelligence, so that in and of itself is a challenge as a caregiver. But her life ended 2 years ago in April. And prior to that, 2 years prior to that, I was a caregiver for my husband, who actually, because of his exposure to asbestos back in England on contracting work, he lost his life to lung cancer. So when I say to you today, and as Karen was saying earlier, when we speak to you, we're speaking to you as caregivers. We know the shoes that you're wearing, they're not the same, they are very similar. So when we tell you, we know where your hearts are, we know those challenges that you face, we know the challenges that may be coming, but more importantly, we want to say to you, you do not have to do this alone, that you have supports along the way. So is that fair enough? Great. So if I could make sure that I say anything about elder abuse today, what would be the one thing or the things that you would want to know before you leave here today? How do you recognize it? We're going to make sure that we provide you with that information. In fact, I've given all of you a copy of our presentation today, and inside that packet that Amy passed out, there is also some additional information about warning signs and about some of the risk factors and indicators. So you will have that information to take home with you today. And if you need additional information, we have some booklets. She would have given you a green booklet. Not yet, but she has one. And it talks more in depth about financial exploitation. It mostly focuses on the long-term care facilities, but there's some really good information in those booklets of things to watch out for in the event that the persons are in those long-term care settings. What else would you want to know? Would you want to know the magnitude of it? How is this really a serious issue? Do you think it's a serious issue? It is. It is a national health problem. And when we say it isn't just a social problem, it isn't just a socioeconomic problem, it is a health care issue. So hopefully we'll share some of that information with you as well today. So what else would you want to know?
Is part of potentially mistreatment due to lack of qualified medical help? It seems that there's a lack of certified nursing assistants and such, that people are always in search of hiring people?
That could be one of the explanations, absolutely. But do you know where the greatest numbers of abuse actually occurs, and what that type of abuse is? It occurs in the community. It occurs at home. And here in the Commonwealth of Virginia, the highest categories are neglect or self-neglect. That's in the 70 percentile when we look at the data that came out of 2015. So that is part of it. That is one of the things that we may not have sufficient caregivers because our aging population is growing. And adults with disabilities, because we have advances in technology, persons with disabilities are living with that disability when many, many years ago they may not have lived with that. So they're vulnerable They're in that vulnerable category that makes them a target for many people who might want to hurt them or try to scam them or financially exploit them. Yeah. So we have some information on that too. Anything else? That you just make sure. So as we get through this, if you see that there are questions or you want to explore one of the topics or the issues a little further, just jump right in and let me know your thoughts. And as I say to everyone, if you want to challenge maybe some information or an issue, I think that affords us an opportunity to be able to talk about it a little bit more. The only way that we could combat elder or adult abuse is to be able to normalize the conversation and to be able to talk about it more, but more importantly, what we can do as a community, what we can do as families, what we can do as individuals. So, when we're looking at the aspects and issues of elder abuse, some of the points of reference I want you to be sure to know. The Older Americans Act in the 1960s, it was actually the nation's commitment to protecting vulnerable older adults who were at risk. So at the federal level, we had to have some kind of laws or some kind of protections in place for the states to be able to construct their own laws and their own guidelines. We also had the Family Violence Prevention and Services Act. This ensured that older adults and adults with disabilities are protected from institutional, community, and domestic violence and sexual assault, and to improve those outreach efforts and other services to those vulnerable adults. We also had the Vulnerable Elder Rights Protection Act. It actually provided provisions for the Long-Term Care Ombudsman Program, and it provided the state legal assistance programs like legal aid for those victims of elder abuse. Also, the Virginia Department of Social Services, they have services that protects a vulnerable adult. And when we look at those adults here in the Commonwealth of Virginia, those are identified as persons who are 60 years of age and older, and adults who are 18 to 59 who have an identified disability. So just remember, it doesn't protect all adults, it's those categories of those adults. And they're looking at abuse, neglect, or exploitation. And they provide those services whenever they receive those reports and they investigate it. The most recent effort at the national level actually is the Elder Justice Act. It takes aim at developing and implementing strategies to decrease the likelihood of elder abuse, neglect, and exploitation. If any of you, maybe a number of weeks ago, listened to some of the hearings with Congress, they were actually looking at elder abuse, neglect, and exploitation, and they were looking at what more needed to be done at the national level. And two things that came out of those conversations were the need for a national database of the perpetrators that were identified in substantiated cases, and the need to study and I want to say demographics. It's who that perpetrator is. What does that perpetrator look like? We study the victims, we know that, but we don't have a real concrete idea of what the perpetrator looks like. And believe it or not, perpetrators of elder abuse, neglect, or exploitation can look like any one of us. I think maybe many of you remember, it was a great number of years ago when Mickey Rooney testified before Congress. Do you remember seeing that? You didn't. It was very moving. He was a victim of financial exploitation at the hands of a family member. And his testimony was extremely important. And I will also tell you, when they were doing those hearings on elder financial abuse and exploitation, they used some of the research that actually two of the researchers at the Center for Gerontology here at Virginia Tech did, Dr. Karen Roberto and Dr. Pam Teester. They used their MetLife study as that cornerstone for looking at the magnitude of elder financial exploitation. If I were to say to you, if I have a conversation with you, if I say elder abuse versus mistreatment, which terminology would you feel more comfortable having a conversation about? Mistreatment. Absolutely, and that's probably a little bit easier to digest, and many people think that elder abuse is probably more severe than mistreatment. Those terms are always typically used interchangeably, and it depends on the person who's using that terminology. If we look at elder abuse, it's any form of mistreatment that results in harm or loss to an older person. It also is defined as the physical, sexual, or emotional abuse of an elderly person, usually, not always, usually one who is disabled or frail. And here in the Commonwealth of Virginia, some of the terminology is knowingly and intentionally. But I will tell you that it isn't always intentional. Sometimes the abuse or the neglect happens when caregivers are trying so hard, or the elder is trying so hard to remain independent, and they don't do it intentionally, but it happens. Or the negligent act by a caregiver or any other person that causes harm, or that person is at serious risk of harm. So it doesn't just mean that it has already happened. It could also mean that they are at risk for it to happen. It's an all-inclusive term representing different types of abusive behavior against the elderly and adults with disabilities, and it can refer to a specific act, and hear this phrase, physical violence. Because when someone abuses another individual, it's violence. When someone abuses an elder, that's exactly what it is. When they physically assault them, it is a violent act. And sometimes that's kind of hard to swallow, or hard to kind of wrap your head around that kind of terminology. But this one, I found this phrase, and I think this is all-encompassing, and it probably better describes what elder abuse really is. It is a single or repeated act or the lack of appropriate action occurring within any relationship where there is an expectation of trust which causes harm or distress to an older person. What do you think about that definition? That's sort of all-encompassing, isn't it?
Kind of broad.
It is kind of broad, absolutely. And elder abuse it is not just within these parameters. It can be very, very broad, and especially when we're looking at the individual cases. But let's take a look at the terminology mistreatment. There is no universal agreement or a definition on what elder mistreatment is. We don't have a national definition that we go by. It is as different as persons are. So therein lies some of the issues or some of the problem. The failure to do something that harms an elderly person or threatens to harm their health, safety, and welfare, or their well-being. It also can be self or other inflicted suffering unnecessarily to the maintenance of the quality of life of that older person. Do you see? And the mistreatment is a broader terminology and no real specific definition. It is actually an umbrella term for a widespread public health problem. And it is also, and I will tell you, it is also a socioeconomic problem. Dr. Roberto and Dr. Pam Teester, when they did the MetLife study, they determined, and this was a very conservative figure, that nearly $2.9 billion is taken from our elders every year. That's a conservative figure. Some of the national stats that we see is that for every one case of financial exploitation that is reported, there are 14 more that go unreported. For every one case, nationally speaking, of elder abuse that is reported, nationally, 5 to 7 more cases go unreported. You see the challenges we have? So that's why it's important that we kind of look at some of, what are some of the indicators, what are some of the risk factors. We also need to be aware that when they're younger and they experience domestic violence, please know that often that domestic violence does not go away as a person ages. If persons are in an abusive relationship in the beginning and they do not remove themselves from that, domestic violence grows old. Can I give you an anecdote? When I went into a nursing facility to visit, she was just a petite little thing and probably half the size of me, probably a third the size of me. And she had gone in for skilled nursing care and rehabilitation to be able to walk again. The entire skin and muscle on the front of her shin was ripped away. And we couldn't figure out what had happened. And she said, and she still had her mind about her, she fell up the stairs. So how does someone rip the skin off their shin if they're coming up the stairs? You have to go down the stairs. You know, you lose your balance. What we discovered later, after talking with her and trying to put protections in place, and we were putting domestic violence program services in place for her, we discovered that her husband kept her locked in the basement and had her defecate in a bucket. And when she was trying to come up the steps, she was trying to get out. And he pushed her down the stairs. And the domestic violence continued as she was in the long-term care setting. So we were able to counsel her. We were able to get some supports in place for her and put protective measures in place. And what ended up happening, they both ended up with a separate guardian because they began to have to demonstrate some incapacities, and they were placed in separate facilities. And she lived out her life in peace because of the guardian's placement for her in a safe setting. That happens, and that's probably one of the more horrific things that we've seen, but we see some of these things. So domestic violence does grow old. If we look at elder abuse and neglect, the incidence and the prevalence of it, it appears that female elders are abused at a higher rate than males, and they also experience more health problems, especially joint problems and heart problems. The older one is, the more likely the person is to be abused. Although more research is really needed, and that's what our Congress is saying when they're doing these hearings, most cases of elder abuse are perpetrated by known or trusted individuals, particularly family members. In those cases that are reported to Adult Protective Services, the abuser was most often an adult child. But some of the studies, and some of the studies at the national level and within our communities, in those senior communities, found more spouse and partner abuse than abuse by an older adult child. So we have to be mindful of those particular scenarios. An overwhelming number of cases of abuse, neglect, and exploitation, as I said just a wee bit ago, it goes undetected and untreated each year, each day, each month. We know those cases are there. Here in Montgomery County, if I remember the stats from the 2015 report, there were 114 cases of elder or adult abuse reported. Now, we'll tell you that number has gone down significantly. From a number of years ago, they were nearly 400 cases. I don't believe the incidents are lessening. I believe the less reports are being made. In your packet, I've included for you a report. It's an excerpt from the 2015 Adult Protective Services report that gives you the total figure of how many reports went into the Department of Social Services last year. It's nearly 23,000 reports received. And I've given you some demographics about who that victim looks like. It's a white female over 60. That's the highest category of the victim. So I've given you that information for you to look at a little bit further. In the program year, as I just said, 2015, the local departments of social services reported a receipt of 22,658, nearly 23,000 reports of adult abuse, with a 4.7 increase from 2014. Over 9,000 of those cases were substantiated. So let me help you do some math for a moment. Remember what I said just a few moments ago? For every one that goes reported, there are 5 to 7 more that go unreported. Multiply 7 times 23. But no, I can see where your heart's, and I see it on your face that this is alarming. It is alarming. But as we get through it, I'm going to tell you, there is hope when we can help one life breathe a little easier today. In program year 2015, self-neglect, as I said earlier, remains the most common type of abuse in substantiated adult protective services cases here in the Commonwealth of Virginia. So what does that tell you? If it's self-neglect, what does that tell you that we need to do as individuals, we need to do as families, we need to do as communities? Be aware.
And are the cases reported by a certain group of people more predominantly, like neighbors, or like how's that reported out?
If you actually go onto the Virginia Department of Social Services website, and what I can do, if Amy would want me to, I can send that report. It's public information, and if you want it, we can forward it on to you. It comes from a variety of sources. It's going to be those persons who have direct contact or providing direct services to that older adult or the adult with a disability. Now, those persons are required by the laws in Virginia. They're called mandated reporters. If they suspect that something's happening, whether it be firsthand knowledge, secondhand, or just word of mouth, they're required to report that. So it's going to be a variety of persons. I will tell you, in one of our localities here in the New River Valley, actually a building inspector made a report.
Yes.
Who said yes? Oh,
Yes.
made a report because he saw the grass wasn't being mowed. He saw the house was deteriorating. Then he knocked on the door.
Okay, that's good.
And he found that she was self-neglecting. And then further exploration was that the daughter was stealing her money.
Okay.
So anybody can make those reports, but I'll make sure if it would be helpful and you can kind of see a little bit more what the Departments of Social Services do. When I get back to my office, I'll forward that to you, Amy, and then you can share it with others who might be interested. So in your packet, I've given you what the risk factors are in your packet of information. When we look at the risk factors, we're going to look at who's going to be at risk. Who are going to be, what are those things that we might see? At an individual level, it could be a current diagnosis of mental illness. It could be a current abuse of alcohol. This could be the perpetrator, or it could be the elder or the adult themselves. So keep in mind that these risk factors can pertain to either one of them. High levels of hostility, inadequate preparation or training for caregiving responsibilities. That goes back to what you were talking about. Our aging population is growing, and we do not have enough community-based services now to be able to meet the needs of older adults. And it is a hard profession to be a caregiver. And we don't have sufficient caregivers in the workforce to be able to meet those needs. So that is a contributing factor. There's an assumption of caregiving responsibilities at an early age. Guess what age group is the fastest growing age group that is caring for older adults? Who do you think that is? 40s? Good guess. Sandwich generation, where you're taking care of your children and trying to take care of older adults, your parents, grandparents, or whatever. It actually is the teenage population. They are fastest growing, and they are assuming more responsibilities for caring for grandparents, for caring for disabled parents. That is one of the fastest growing populations in that caregiving role. And they're thrust into it. So I'm probably older than a number of you here in the room. I can remember taking care of my grandmother at the age of 15 and literally physically picking her up to put her into, we didn't have a shower, we had a tub. But we took care of aging grandparents for as long as I can remember. or an extended family member. So that is a fast-growing population, and assuming those roles at an early or an earlier age. Inadequate coping skills. Exposure to abuse as a child makes the likelihood of that happening, the risk of it is pretty high. But I will say to you, it doesn't necessarily mean that it will happen. If a person is abused as a child, does not mean that they will grow up to be an abuser. It comes down to who or what entities were in their lives to help them become resilient and to help them get past the abuse and to see that abuse is not necessary to have a good life. So please know it doesn't mean that they will grow up to be those abusers. At a relationship level, there is a high financial and emotional dependence on the vulnerable elder. There are persons who are living off of the income of an elder, or they are taking their medications, or they're stealing their medications, but they have a high financial dependence on them in some way, shape, or fashion when we have these cases of elder abuse. Past experiences of disruptive behavior, the lack of social support, or isolation, social isolation, that makes a person at a higher risk for being abused. When persons are isolated from others or they don't have someone in regular contact with them. A lack of formal support. But at the community level, let's look at the community level. This is what we were just talking about. The formal services, such as respite care, for those providing care to the elders, are limited, inaccessible, or unavailable. Now, you'll hear me, my next comment is going to be with great pride. I work with wonderful staff people through the Agency on Aging, and also some other entities throughout the New River Valley and that aging network, and we try to support each other and stay connected to be able to meet the needs of our aging population. But the needs are so great and the funding is insufficient. We rely, with our Agency on Aging, we rely on Older Americans Act funding, we rely on the Commonwealth of Virginia, the General Assembly funding, we rely on contributions or donations, fee for services, but it's not enough to meet the needs. With our Homemaker program, we have a long waiting list. And sometimes Homemaker services of 2 to 3 hours a week will make the difference in the person going into a nursing home or not. So if we don't have enough formal services or supports, and they have to remain in their home longer, that makes them at a greater risk if those support services are not available to them. But I'm going to tell you, you get all of us aging people around and all of the professionals that work on the needs or that provide the services to support the needs of older adults, we're going to die trying. I tell someone that I'm still enough of an oppositional defiant child that if somebody says, why? Now, according to my philosophy instructor, I'm going to ask the next question. What do you think that is? Why not? You must have gone to the same professor. So we have to keep thinking about some of these risk factors and how can we eliminate or decrease the exposure to some of these to lessen the incidence of elder abuse, neglect, or exploitation. At the society level or at the national level, there's a high tolerance and acceptance of aggressive behavior. Did any of you see CNN this morning? I'm going to stop watching that news. We as a nation are watching these aggressive behaviors, these violent acts, and it's becoming normalized. Do you think? And I'm not speaking for the agency, I'm saying from my experiences in working with domestic violence, sexual assault victims, and working with elder abuse program, it's becoming normalized that this is what our nation is coming to. And it breaks my heart to know that. Also at a society level, the healthcare personnel, guardians, and other agents are given greater freedom in routine care provision and decision making. And there is mismanagement of funds, there is guardianship not guardianship, but there are guardians who misuse their power. There also is under power of attorney, the agent can misuse their power. If you don't take anything from what I say today, know this, that persons who construct a power of attorney or an advance medical directive, they have a right to continue to make decisions for and on behalf of themselves as long as they are capacitated to make that decision. And the authority of the agent of the power of attorney does not become effective until the terms of that power of attorney is identified. Usually it's if they're defined as incapacitated by 2 physicians. That's typically what I see. But I have seen persons come in and say, I'm the power of attorney. No, power of attorney is a document. The agent is the individual, and the agent has only the responsibilities as defined in that power of attorney. They still have rights to make decisions. And as much as we want to help make sure that they don't make bad decisions, our elders and adults with disabilities have a right to make poor decisions. It's called the right to self-determination. And sometimes that's so hard to watch. That's so hard to see kind of it happen. You back up just a little bit. It's sort of like when we taught our children how to ride a bicycle. You know they were going to skin their knees or stub their toe, but eventually they learned how to ride the bike. When you let go, but you were there when you were needed. So be mindful that that's what we're seeing at a society level or at a national level and even within our own communities. Family members are expected to care for elders without seeking help from others. Persons are encouraged to endure that suffering, or they impose that upon themselves, or they remain silent regarding their pains or regarding what they're going through. They don't want anybody to know. This is a family secret. This is something they put themselves in the middle of, and they suffer in silence. And that's the unfortunate part. There are, at a society level, there are negative beliefs about aging, or what we call ageism. The characteristics of institutional settings, which may also include those unsympathetic or negative attitudes toward residents, chronic staffing problems. This goes back to what you were kind of looking at. Chronic staff problems, lack of administrative oversight, staff burnout, and stressful working conditions. You often hear they don't have enough help in the nursing homes. But I will tell you, the majority of the abuse does not occur in the nursing homes or in the assisted living. It does occur, but there are so many regulations for interventions if that were to occur to keep them safe and to make sure that they're protected, to make sure that they're treated with dignity and respect. If we look at some of the warning signs, I've put in your packet the indicators of elder abuse, and we'll run through that real quick. If we look at, there are different categories: financial abuse, exploitation, psychological and emotional abuse, physical and sexual abuse, and neglect. If we'll look, let's take a few of them. Under financial abuse or exploitation, there are a lack of amenities that the victim actually could afford. Like if you see the bills aren't being paid or they don't have food in the cabinets, you'll see those things when you're there in that setting. The caregiver has control of the elder's money, but is failing to provide for the elder's needs. And if we look at, let's go down to the psychological or emotional abuse. Unexplained or uncharacteristic changes in behavior, such as withdrawal from normal activities, unexplained changes in their alertness. I'll tell you the one way that you can tell if an elder was abused in an earlier life. If you approach an elder, and I see it more in the nursing homes when I go to visit, when the caregivers get close to them and the caregivers move quickly, come into their space real quickly, and if they have been abused, they'll do this. Right? What do you think they would do that for? If I were to come at you and I were to try to slap at you or beat you or something, your defense mechanism is this. And we'll see that. And we'll see disclosures. They'll start talking about, we had a couple of situations where elders, for the first time in their life, they were in their mid-80s, they started talking about the sexual abuse as a child. And we were able to get them some services and supports for trauma-informed care. So you'll see some of those psychological or emotional indicators as well. The caregiver can be verbally aggressive or demeaning, controlling, overly concerned about spending money, or you might see them as uncaring. If we look at the sexual abuse, unexplained sexually transmitted diseases, unless an elder, and please know I don't mean to be rude to anyone, unless they're sexually active, unless they have it's been untreated, if you see a sexually transmitted disease and they haven't had those relationships, then you have to question what has happened. That they may have been sexually assaulted, or they may have been raped. Please know that these are not the only indicators. If we look at neglect, this is the majority of what we're seeing. Lack of basic hygiene, adequate food or clean and appropriate clothing, lack of medical aids. Please know that we know that persons with dementia are left unsupervised. If they cannot recognize danger or safety, that's inadequate supervision. If they can't recognize danger or safety, or get themselves out of a situation. So these are just some things that we might see: untreated pressure areas, or what some people refer to as bed sores, that they go untreated and they can advance very, very quickly if it's untreated. Or pressure relieving measures are not implemented. But I've included in there it just gives you a brief overview that these may be some of the indicators of abuse, neglect, or exploitation. The role of the elder care workers, those persons who are providing care to them, owing to the close contact and relationship that these workers have with clients, these individuals are in an excellent position to observe abuse by family members or abuse by unscrupulous business practices and predatory individuals. They are in a very good position to be able to see that. One of the things that we're actually encouraging doctors to do is to screen for abuse. Let me give you something if you ever have an opportunity to call the Women's Resource Center. If you haven't, when they answer the phone, you know how they answer the phone? They'll say, Women's Resource Center, are you safe? So they're screening straight away when they answer that phone. But what we're trying to do is we're trying to encourage people and trying to encourage healthcare professionals to be able to assess or screen for abuse in later life. And these are some of the suggestions for that screening. If you have those situations, there are some considerations for reporting that abuse. Be mindful that when those reports are made, that report is made to ensure their health, safety, and well-being. Look at the types of abuse that mandated reporters are required to report, but you as a community, you as a family member can make those reports and have a conversation with the local Department of Social Services about whether or not they can investigate that. In your packet, I've also included the contact information for all of the Departments of Social Services throughout the New River Valley. So if at any point you ever have a need or you know someone has that need to make that report, you have that available to you. And looking at who those reports need to be made to, those reports are made to the locality where that incident may have happened or where that person lives, whichever one is most prominent. And they'll investigate that report, and their involvement is to work to resolve the situation. It is not within their purview to remove the older adult every time they get the report. They're there to resolve the abuse and neglect and some of the issues, and most often it's meant to provide services and supports or make referrals to some of the aging service professionals or to the program.
Can I ask you, because I deal with a lot of retirees all across the country.
Yes, ma'am.
I was to have someone confide in me where I suspected it, but they don't live in Montgomery County. Could you assist me in finding the locality that could assist with that?
So I'm going to tell you one of my secrets. And some of my coworkers kind of laugh at me. I rattle off telephone numbers, or I have a secret stash of information. So wherever it is in the United States, I can find you the local Department of Social Services or the local Ombudsman program that can help you identify who those are. So I just told you one of my secrets. And there are provisions for confidentiality and they can talk with you about how that reporting will actually benefit that elder. And keep in mind, they have a right to self-determination. If they go in there and they say, I don't want your services, and they are capacitated, the Adult Protective Services cannot stay there if they refuse those services and they're capacitated. So keep that in mind, that it's the right to self-determination. The key to prevention and intervention of elder abuse is the ability to recognize the warning signs of its occurrence. So looking at towards prevention, what we want to do is education and awareness. And I can't thank Amy and the staff here at Virginia Tech and all of the other service agencies that afford us the opportunity to come and do the presentations and to give you this information and to create the conversation so we normalize this conversation. It's also important that we recognize what financial abuse is and the extent of financial abuse, but more importantly, what we can do to protect ourselves, what we can do to protect our vulnerable older adults and the vulnerable adults with disabilities. We have community-based networks that all can work together and provide that comprehensive support in the event that these situations arise. And if you have any questions or you want to talk to someone about a specific situation, you can call our Agency on Aging. And my first comment to persons when they call to talk to me, let's just have a conversation. Let's talk about what the situation is. Let's just have a conversation. And there have been times when I've had persons in my office and they were pretty loud, but by the time, and there was lots of crying going on, but by the time they left the office after talking about the situation, they left with something more than they came with. And they left without the burden of the responsibility of knowing that a family member was being abused, but resources that could help them. When we look at prevention strategies, some of the things that we're talking about at a national level now are the abuse registries and criminal background checks, addressing the issue of ageism, looking at advanced planning tools, plan ahead and put wishes in place and make sure that those documents are used for the benefit of the older adult. We also look at public awareness to communicate the extent of elder abuse, but more importantly, how we can improve that situation. And I've given in the handout as well, so that we can be mindful of the time, some of the things that are happening and some of the things that we can turn to, some of the entities that we can turn to when we try to address this situation, and looking at some of the community services and supports that are needed, and looking at the healthcare professionals and their role and responsibility in this national issue. If you go to your physician, the physician should be asking you, is anyone hurting you? They might like that question better than, is anyone abusing you? Or are you safe? So we look to those healthcare professionals for developing those diagnostic and those assessment tools or those guidelines so that they can recognize it a little bit further, educating those healthcare professionals more and more, and looking at staff development and training. These are some additional resources that you can turn to for some additional information. We as Agency on Aging staff and those that we are connected with in our aging network will make ourselves available to you if you have questions or if you need additional supports or if you just want to have the conversation. Here's our contact information that if you want to reach out and talk to any one of us, we have, and I will selfishly say that we have some of the finest professionals in our office and a wealth of expertise and knowledge, and many who have been there for a great number of years. And you will always, well, I shouldn't say always, for the most part, you will get a live voice. We will not put you into that loop of press 1 to get, But if we're not available, you will get our voicemail, but we return the calls as quickly as we can. So, let me go back. Do you feel heavy from this topic? How do you feel now? Angry? So if you're angry about it, and I'm going to ask the rhetorical question, What can you as an individual, what can you do as a community member, and what can you do as a citizen of the Commonwealth and the United States? What can you do about that? You can give voice to those in need. So think about your question. Think about what can you do? You had a question or comment?
I have a very independent person and taking care of everything. The bathing thing, we asked about that, and he sort of sponges and everything. So when does it become where he's making
Poor decisions?
determination and when you're like,
When you start seeing what they call skin breakdown, when you start seeing sores develop and things, then you might have to go a little further. But there's a wonderful video. Can I give you the name of it? Gives you some wonderful strategies. It's called Bathing Without a Battle. And believe me, being a caregiver of a stubborn, obstinate Brit and an independent young woman, I just had to set my foot down as a mother with both of them. I will not allow you to get in my car if you smell like that. Now, I will help you. I'll be supportive. But that was a personal note or whatever. You figure out a way. And you figure out when it becomes harmful to that individual and how far you really need to take it. That's when it's really concerning. Any other questions or comments?
And I would add to that, Janet, when you reach out for help, maybe you're not the best person to assist you with. Maybe there is someone else that maybe
she's
has
having
to-
problems too. So it's seeing, we've got,
or an agency or someone else that may be able to support. I work with families all the time who say, well, I can't use the resources I'm saving for a rainy day. It's raining. It's raining sometimes, and, reaching out.
And think about,
he also grew up where he didn't have a bathroom when he was young.
and the sponge bath,
Yeah.
and is what they call a spit bath.
So he brings that up a lot of times.
Okay, so if you give them a pan of water and soap and a washcloth and they're washing all their parts, is that just as effective?
Well, there's certain parts that smell more than others.
Uh-huh.
He can get him, he'll get his top part pretty good.
Okay. Think about the bathing experience. If some of us, if we have really tough days, we say the bathing experience I'd love to have is to sit back in that clawfoot bathtub with water this deep. Mm-hmm. Yeah? Mm-hmm. Music playing, bubbles. That's you don't want that image right now. I know you don't. But think about the bathing experience. What is that experience for him versus what you need him to do in that bathing opportunity? And that's where Annette was saying, maybe somebody can help you with that. A respite care provider or something that might be able to help with that situation a little better. Because what you've done, and I said a little bit earlier, you've reversed your role. You've now assumed a parental role. Yeah? Okay. And that's the challenge. That's hard. Any other questions or comments? Either one. Go ahead.
All right, you handle the New River, Osage, that area. Who handles like Roanoke, Salem area, Bedford, that way?
As the long-term care ombudsman, that would be Jennifer Stokes. And Jennifer is with the LOA Area Agency on Aging. And my coworkers and my partners in crime, quote unquote crime, will laugh when I give you the phone number because I just know the numbers. 345 04 51. I'm a telephone number, so just whatever. Pardon?
Every area has their own ombudsman.
We do. We have ombudsmen throughout the entire Commonwealth of Virginia, and I will tell you all the states in the United States have an ombudsman program. And we are as different as we are in our personalities, but my experiences and my education and the wonderful opportunities that I have had brings me to where I am now, and I have a chance to do my heart's work. You had a question or a comment?
You mentioned of people who can't afford services but feel like they need to save their money. Or in my mother's case, we'll go do like domestic help too, and I don't have any work for it to do, so I can pay for the other. Are there suggestions as to how to approach that conversation of, you really need to spend the money because you're
That's a conversation to begin with your mom or your dad, and you look at where their thought process is in the expenditure. Well, can we explore the Agency on Aging Services? Can we explore the Alzheimer's Association? Can we explore the pension benefits through the Veterans Administration? And maybe start the conversation with an exploration of what might be out there to support you and support your expenditures where you don't have to spend all of your money. That might be an easier way to enter into that conversation where someone has worked so hard for so long and they want to save that money that they worked so hard for, or their assets and their resources.
so essentially looking for cost-subsidized services as a way into.
Could be. It could be. And
Because what ends up happening is then there's it doesn't cost a lot of abuse, but there's mistreatment that goes on. Just because the caretaker is totally stressed
sure.
and other.
And we know that the caregiver needs that break too. So, think about what supports might be there to give the caregiver a break. And also think about, you can choose agency services and supports, which probably are about $17, $18 an hour to as much as $20 or $25, or private caregivers or private entities, programs through the Veterans Administration. If any of you have a loved one, or if any of you are a veteran, there is a pension benefit. It's called the Aid in Attendance Pension Benefit that will help pay for in-home supports for a veteran and a veteran spouse. There are eligibility criteria, absolutely. I would suggest, if that pertains to your situation, you go through the Virginia Department of Veterans Services first, not the VA. Don't let that be your first, because the VA is so large. But the Veterans Services can help you explore those pensions and explore, if it's appropriate, the Aid in Attendance Pension Benefit to help get a caregiver in the home. I've taken so much more time.
We're going by my clock instead of this clock. So thank you, Janet. And
You're
Janet's
welcome.
going to be here for further questions.